Hello and welcome to Season 2 of The Garden Log. This is episode 44, and I'm calling it Season 2 because this is The Garden Log's second growing season. I started over a year ago on October the 1st, 2017. In honour of this anniversary, I went back and listened to that first episode again, and I expected to be mortified, like someone going back and reading their secondary school poetry. But actually, it sounds identical. I have just stagnated on the course of least resistance, but it seems to be working, so here's to another year. This week has been very warm, unusually warm for October. In fact, one of the days was the warmest October day for almost a decade. It's strange. The weather's changed now as I'm recording this. I'm recording this having just eaten a massive amount of cheese and biscuits because it has started raining, the weather has turned, there's a fire on in one of the other rooms, there is a bottle of red wine open somewhere waiting for me after this recording. So now we're back to autumn proper, but the events that I'm about to recount, those things that happened in the week just been, took place in an unseasonable glow. And that's enough teasing you. Let's go and hear about those momentous happenings as we listen to The Week in Gardening. Welcome to The Week in Gardening. This week started with great excitement as we had some new plants arriving. Over the weekend, my able assistant went off with the garden debit card to Great Dixter, where they were holding their annual plant fair. Well, the autumn plant fair. I think there's various ones. This is the Aster heavy one, where there are lots of Michaelmas daisies hanging around. There are lots of other good things as well, because Great Dixter seems to hold the nurseryman's crown. It is the preeminent place for flogging plants to punters, so they get the cream of the British growers, and the Dutch growers, and the Italian growers. People come from far and wide to sell at this place. And the most exciting thing that got brought back to our garden was a little shrub, which is Ugni, the Chilean guava. And if you do any research on this, people will tell you that it was the favourite fruit of Queen Victoria. Even on the plant label, it said this was the favourite fruit of Queen Victoria. And I think this is one of those sort of internet rumours that build and build because there's no other information about the Chilean guava, apart from a couple of articles by James Wong. Lots of foods were probably a favourite of Queen Victoria, hence all of the obesity and indigestion and terrible flatulence. I don't know if anyone's read the book by Annie Gray about the eating habits of the Queen Victoria. There's a brilliant story in that about Queen Victoria, who as a young girl made a solemn vow that when she was full grown she would eat mutton every day. And by Jove, I suppose she did. I think sometimes she ate 9 courses in half an hour. Anyway, some of those courses were Ugni. And I can see why. The berries are remarkable. They have that almost perfumed sweetness that comes from something like a wild strawberry. And then there is a peppery taste that I don't know if it's a peppery taste or a peppery feeling in the mouth that comes from the tiny little seeds. Feels like you might be chewing on a little bit of pepper. And then there's another more somehow marzipan-y flavour in there, though I don't know if I'm implying flavours that it doesn't have because I can't find the right taste descriptions. Anyway, it's a remarkable berry, and apparently the ones that I've been eating this week have been at the beginning of their development towards ripeness, and they won't be at their best until November. They turn red deceptively early, but you need to leave them until they are really sinister and maroon. So that's very good. And I'm going to plant that, well, in fact I have planted it, on a south-facing wall where it can get sun and shelter. There's some debate about whether it's a plant for the understory that needs shade or a plant for blasting in the sunlight, and I'm going to blast it with sunlight and see how it copes. The plant's in the myrtle family, and it has small leaves, small quite yellowish green leaves at the moment, which aren't the prettiest tone, but I think they might be due to its being in a little pot. Maybe it'll green up a little bit, and I think it's going to have nice bell-shaped flowers. It's growing at the moment underneath some climbing roses, some Shropshire lad, and I think hopefully it should get to a sort of metre by 1 metre sized wall shrub. You can grow it as a hedge apparently, so that's something to look into as well. So that's our link to previous monarchs. I think it makes nice jams and preserves and quinces. I think that's probably how Queen Victoria ate it. She probably didn't munch the berries down as part of a handful. She probably had some sort of set jelly that she slathered over her side of mutton and wolfed that down. Because there's nothing that eases grief like meat and jam. So that was Monday. It was a good day for new plants and thinking about old queens. Tuesday was a bulb day, very bulbous indeed. We scattered more daffodils in the meadow. I suppose when I talk about it in terms of bulbs, I should revert back to calling it a flowery mead. In the flowery mead, we scattered the daffs. The first thing we did here was to cut the grass very, very low. And there's two reasons for this. One is that it makes it slightly easier to puncture the soil with your planting implement. Not much easier in our case because we are dealing with the clay and the flint and the other things that lie concealed beneath that ground. And the second reason is because you don't miss the daffodils that way. They don't hide in a tuft of grass and get ignored and then still force their roots out slowly sideways into the ground and start growing and then get chewed up by the first mow of spring, as sometimes happens when one scatters daffodils in longer grass. The daffodils we're planting this time are another variety of tall daffodils, this time ice follies, because I wanted a bit more of that limey limoncello yellow in the garden. We've got the Carlton orange, we've got the pheasant's eye white, and I wanted that lemony shade in the middle there. The other daffodils were planted in greater numbers and on more of a matrix spacing. Basically, I planted them everywhere. These I wanted more clustered, so I went for a sort of starburst effect. It's quite hard to visualize. If you were to think about one of those commercials advertising a migraine headache, it starts as a little ball of pain and it shoots along the neurons. Imagine an advertising executive telling his graphic design team, you've got to see that the pain, it starts deep in this cortex and it shoots out and it affects every part of the brain in little cluster bomb explosions. And that's what I told my gardening team. So hopefully we've got this epicenter and the sort of fragmentary viral explosions coming out from it. It's a very exciting way to describe what is going to be just a very lovely and pretty bit of planting. As I did last year, I brought the bulb planter out again, and as I did last year, I discarded it in disgust. It just does not work in this soil, so we went back to mattocks and trenching shovels. Trenching shovels, by the way, are a godsend. Everyone should get a trenching shovel. Those are the long, scoop-bladed shovels. They tend to be made entirely of one piece of metal, which is great because you don't have the weakness between metal and wood that you get on normal forks and spades, and they have quite a narrow tip to them, so they're very, very good for slamming hard into the ground and making little bulb-shaped holes. It wasn't just daffodils. Around the daffodil migraine, I put in some Camassia, and that's Camassia cusickii. And this is an experiment because I don't know if the deer will eat Camassia cusickii. They don't eat daffodils, but they might eat Camassia. But if they don't, God, what an effect it would be. It would be absolutely lovely to have them established in there. So there's 30 or so of those, and hopefully the muntjac decide they don't want to eat them, they want to eat something else. And if that is the case, then next year we'll get 5,000 and go whole hog on the thing. I always feel very worthy after a day's bulb planting. I don't know why. It's the investing in the future. It's what it must feel like for more fiscally prudent people when they make a great big deposit in the ISA. I'm a gardener, so you have no ISAs, but that was a very nice feeling nonetheless. On Wednesday, we set up the propagation bench. This is very exciting. So the greenhouse is heated. It's heated by 2 little electric bar heaters, and they are fine for basically fighting the frost off the whole house, but they don't give the basal heat that you need for cuttings and for germinating seeds very early. So I've got a heat mat. This heat mat it's fairly big for a domestic setup. It's 2 meters by 60 centimeters, and it fits perfectly on one of the potting benches. So I put that down on the potting bench, and it's very space age. It's silver foil, and so it looks like something that might be taken by probably an early 70s astronaut on one of his adventures into the unknown. So that's been covered with those expanded clay balls that you might use for rooting something in a hydroponic medium. It looks very good, and actually it whacks out a lot of heat, so it's going to be great for the little cuttings that we've taken this autumn and those early seeds, and for some of the things that we're going to overwinter. It was slightly strange being under the glass playing with all these heating elements on Wednesday because it was so hot. It was amazingly warm, the warmest October day for almost a decade. And it leads to some sort of psychic disturbance, I think. What it is uncanny, because the time of year is not suited to heat. For example, I go past quite a few perfect English village greens, and one of these English village greens is bordered by horse chestnuts. And as everyone knows, the horse chestnut is in all sorts of trouble at the moment. There's the leaf miners and then various fungal things. Whatever they are, they're battering these poor trees. So they've dropped their leaves already. But seeing this English village green with bare trees and a heat haze across it, it gave it a sort of post-apocalyptic edge, as if we were living in the end times. Very good business for publicans, though. I certainly went out for a drink after work, and I'm sure many of you did too, so cheers to that. Thursday I was not at the garden. I was on my master's course, the Masters in Garden History. And I don't think I will normally talk about this because you don't really want to hear intricate debates about various obscure and essentially meaningless contentions in the world of gardens past. But this week I went on a trip, on a class outing, and we went to Hampton Court. And I've been to Hampton Court before. It's a brilliant garden. I love the gardens at Hampton Court, particularly the pond gardens, the sunken garden in particular, and the vine in there. But I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about seeing the gardeners at work. Whenever I've gone before, and whenever I visit any garden, I realise I go on the weekend because that's when I'm free. And so I see them empty and devoid of work. Those like me who tend to the spaces are off visiting other gardens or doing whatever they do on their weekends, playing Monopoly maybe. And so I don't see them. But this time they were all out and about and working, and it was wonderful to see them at it. It reminded me of my time working in gardens open to the public. You spend a lot of time showing your tractor to the various small boys and girls in the garden, and a lot of time chatting to people about things they planted a long time ago and can't quite remember the name of. And a lot of time, it seems, setting out winter bedding. That was what they were doing at Hampton Court, putting out all their wallflowers for the spring. And a very good job they were doing too. Hampton Court as well, the pond garden and the vine and the fountain garden and the avenues, you need to pay to get in to see as part of the house ticket, and it's actually quite pricey, but there's loads of really good stuff you can get to see for free, particularly the kitchen garden, which is magnificently run and really, really full of leaf and produce still. And also the wilderness, which is one of the older parts of the garden. It's almost pre-Henry VIII. It's Cardinal Wolsey's day when that was set out. So there's lots to see, even if you are a complete and utter cheapskate. So go to Hampton Court. A little recommendation earlier than the recommendation section. Friday was windy. It was really windy. It was the wind picking up bins and chucking them around. And I think that this year must have been a mast year for beech in particular. I've never seen so many beech nuts and kernels. I cycle to work. Well, I cycle and then I get on the train and then I do another cycle ride. And I lean my bike against a hedge normally and I hang my helmet from my handlebars. And after Friday I got back onto my bicycle and the whole helmet was fill up with beech kernels. A whole head's worth of beech kernels had fallen in one day into my helmet. When I got back onto the bike to cycle home, the lanes were lying thick with the kernels, and they had tracks through them like tyre marks in fresh snow. It was like wearing brown sunglasses on a ski slope. I was planting some bedding of my own, inspired by Hampton Court, of course, but I was planting violas and winter pansies under the oak, and there I was bombarded with acorns. I also planted some florist cyclamen. You'll know florist cyclamen. Those are those very, very big flowered cyclamen that get sold around this time of year. And you start seeing them appearing on windowsills and in garden centres. They're either a pink with a little tinge of white or a magenta. And we were planting the magenta form, planting them outside and planting them in deep shade among the Liriope muscari, which I think is a really brilliant combination. Liriope muscari is that grass foliage plant with the bobbly purple flower that isn't much for most of the year, but is always there. It is always evergreen and will grow in deep shade. And the leaves are dark, the same dark as the cyclamen leaves. And the magenta there amongst those spikes, amongst those sword blades, really looks quite striking. I know it's not a permanent solution, but it's bedding, and it's quite attractive. It'll get through, I think, probably until January. Sometimes those florist cyclamen planted outside, they last until February. So it's going to give a really good show, and if it's there at Christmas, I will be more than chuffed. And speaking of more than chuffed, after doing that bit of planting, it was time to get on my bicycle and battle off into the wind. I had some of those moments cycling home where you're pedaling as hard as you can and you're not actually going anywhere. Like some sort of horrible anxiety dream where you're running as fast as you can to get away from something and not moving at all, except it's real life and you just want to get home to start the weekend. I did get home, I survived, and here I am recording this podcast. But this podcast is more than half over, and you're going to want something to do once it's finished. So let's see if I have any horticultural recommendations this week. This week I have been rereading one of my absolute favourite books of all time, which is Aiken Field by Ronald Blythe. And Ronald Blythe basically spent a couple of years in the 60s cycling around a small Suffolk village, interviewing the people who lived there, the ordinary people, the farm labourers, the workers in the forge. And these oral histories were published as Aiken Field. They are lightly fictionalised, and Blythe has a brilliant ear and a brilliant pen, so anyone who speaks comes across as an earthy poet, even if they might not have meant to. I think he talked to them over some of those winters for days on end, teasing slowly the stories out of these people who, as the book repeatedly mentions, are famously taciturn and wary of speaking, particularly about things like emotion. One of my favourite things, this is a book that focuses on survivors of the First World War in a large part, and one of the things about it that comes across is the relationship with land. And land is not necessarily something to be loved. It is something to obsess over, certainly, but it is also something to hate. It is something to loathe. It is something to battle against. He's very good on the relationship of the illiterate farm worker to the land. And these are men who all they have are their bodies, and their strength is something that they are incredibly proud of. And they pitch these bodies against the farm for decade after decade until finally they have no strength left. They are just shells. And when they can no longer work, when they no longer have the physicality, they have nothing. They become timid and old and die. Almost every page of this book could be read out on the podcast, but I'm going to focus on a little bit of one of the accounts of a gardener at the local stately home. And this is a gardener who is 39 when Aiken Field interviews him, but has been working for an elderly lord and lady who are high Victorians surviving into the 20th century. The chapter ends with Christopher Falconer, this gardener, saying, "Real gardening is dying, dying, dying. There aren't many gardeners of my calibre left. I am a young man who has got caught in the old ways. I'm 39 and I am a Victorian gardener, and this is why the world is strange to me." And the world is strange to him, but also it's incredibly recognisable to me from my years of gardening. Falconer gardens for a pair he calls Lordship and Ladyship. And he talks about how formal the relationship between him and his employers is when he starts. This is what he says. "As the years went by, we young men found ourselves being able to talk to Lordship and Ladyship. Never speak to them, not one word, no matter how urgent, until they speak to you," the head gardener told me on my first day. Ladyship drove about the grounds in a motor chair and would have run us over rather than have to say, "Get out of the way." We must never look at her, and she never looked at us. It was the same in the house. If a maid was in a passage and Lordship or Ladyship happened to come along, she would have to face the wall and stand perfectly still until they had passed. I wouldn't think that they felt anything about their servants. We were just there because we were necessary, like water from the tap. And I read this thinking, how terrible, because I work in a place where I consider myself friends with the owners. Then I look back at one of my first gardening jobs before I moved down to Chiswick House, and I worked for an oligarch, a Russian oligarch, and the relationship was identical. We were to neither be seen nor heard. I was allowed to occasionally be seen doing something picturesque because I was slightly more presentable. But if any of the gardeners had long hair or dreadlocks, then they would be sent to hide behind a wall, literally, while the oligarch made his very infrequent tours of the garden. What I like about Falconer is he talks about how they spend all this money on machinery, and he comes to realise that he's just machinery. Gardeners are just machinery, and you can make a stand and say, "I do not want to be treated like this. This is inhumane." But then you're just a bit of faulty machinery, and you get replaced like a faulty gasket to keep the operation running smoothly. In that oligarch's garden, there was never any acknowledgement of good work done. All that was acknowledged were deadlines missed and some unsightly thing like leaves falling on the ground. Goodness, I'd hate to be there now. I feel for those gardeners because there's lots of beech trees in that garden, and I'm sure they're going to get shouted at for the beech kernels falling upon the ground. But Christopher Falconer recognises the importance of praise as well. He says, "If people want to be polite, the first thing they say is, 'What a beautiful garden.' If a man is clipping a hedge, you must compliment him on it. Hedges have to be praised. This is where the old employers went wrong. They didn't understand about praise. If there had been more praise for gardeners, there would still be plenty of good gardeners around. An industrial worker would sooner have a £5 note, but a countryman must have praise." Now, I know there's lots of debates about pay in the horticultural industry at the moment, and I'm not sure that praise is going to solve many of them. But it's nice to be told you're doing a good job. He's also very good about the newcomers to the village, the upwardly mobile, the 60s version of a yuppie. He writes, "The salesman in his new bungalow is a very different story. Their gardening is a form of ownership, and getting on. They garden neatly. They don't know the difference between tidiness and neatness. He's very keen on tidiness. Tidiness, for example, is making sure that you mound your asparagus bed with a 45-degree angle on the soil, even though there is no horticultural or necessarily aesthetic value in it. That's just the tidy way of doing things. Whereas I assume the neat way of doing things is having all of your pebbles arranged properly. He is a wonderful voice from the past, and the book is absolutely full of them. So if you find yourself, as the nights loom ever inwards, in want of a good read, then go and find yourself a copy of Aiken Field. Right, now that we are a year old, I can add a new feature to the podcast. I can add a This Time a Year Ago feature. So This Time a Year Ago was episode 1, and I was introducing myself, and I was talking about my weekly routine. I was claiming that I liked to start the week with a good old-fashioned tidy up, so that I impressed people and started the week in credit, as it were. And I noticed that I did talk about a tidy up, not a neatening of the grounds. So in that ways, I think that maybe I have a little bit of the Victorian gardener in me. I was also talking about chestnut trees. The chestnut was in a very bad harvest that year, and I was wildly speculating. I convinced myself into the microphone that I might need to buy a second chestnut tree to help fertilise the first, even though they're semi-self-fertile. And after that episode was broadcast, a listener, Joff, who now has his own very brilliant podcast, got in touch to say that he thought it was actually just a very bad year for chestnuts. And I'm pleased to say that a year on, he was certainly right. This year, the chestnut harvest is brilliant. I have a whole boot full of chestnuts at the moment, and there's plenty more where they came from. Lovely, big, plump, shiny things. So in some ways, the world is getting better. There are more chestnuts. Well, that's enough from episode 1 and from episode 44. I hope you enjoyed listening to this first episode of Season 2. I certainly enjoyed recording it. I am now going to go and throw another log on the fire and find that glass of wine. I hope that you do something similarly relaxing, and I will see you all again next week for episode 45. Thank you and goodbye.